Okay, we're now ready to turn our attention to a very curious set of operators, which are called suppressing operators. And these operators create an observable, or also a single, that changes or ignores all of or portions of its payload. And we're going to talk about a couple of interesting examples in this lesson, and then we'll talk about other ones in other lessons. So we're going to talk about filter, take, and ignore elements. Filter and take are pretty straightforward. Ignore elements is a lot more interesting and somewhat curious, and at first glance, not really quite sure what the heck it's even doing, but we'll see how it works. We'll start out with the filter operator, and this will actually be very intuitive because Java Streams has something quite much like this. So what the filter operator does is it evaluates each source value in the stream against the given predicate that's passed in. And as is always the case with predicates, the predicate basically just takes a value of type t and returns true or false. So if the predicate test succeeds, the value will be emitted. Otherwise, it will not. It'll be suppressed. If the test fails, the value is ignored and a request is made to get the next element up the string. The observable returned from filter will only contain values that pass the predicate test. So we get back an observable that will only emit things that successfully pass the predicate. Everything else will be suppressed. What does this mean? This again should sound very familiar. It means that the number of elements that are output from filter may be less than or equal to the number of input elements. And of course, it all depends on whether things match or not, whether they pass the predicate test. So if everything matches, you'll end up with the same number, but if some things don't match or if some things aren't true, better way to put it, by the predicate, then they will be dropped, and you'll only get the stuff that actually matches. So here's an example where we're going to generate a bunch of big random integers, and we're going to check to see whether they're odd or even. This is using the big integer operators to check to see if something can be modded by value of 2 that equals 0, which would indicate it's even. And if it's not that case, if they're not even, then we let them through. Otherwise, we suppress them. So that's a simple example of how to use filter. As is the case with other examples you've seen before, like the action operators we just talked about, like do finally and do on complete, filter can't change the type or the value of the elements that it processes. It can just let them through or not. Project Reactor has a filter operator that works exactly the same way. And this should be very familiar to you because Java Streams has a filter operator that also works the same way. So this is similar kind of behavior going through a range from 1 to 100. And we're going to only emit odd numbers. So we can do that by taking each number and ANDing it by, bitwise ANDing it by 1. And if we get back something that doesn't equal 0, then we know it's an odd number and we let it through. Otherwise, we suppress it. The next operator we're going to talk about, we've also alluded to before in an example, but now we're going to take a look at it in a bit more detail. And this is the take operator. And the purpose of the take operator is to take only the first n values of an observable if they are available. The parameter that's passed in is the number of items to allow to be emitted from this observable before we suppress the rest of the output. And it returns an observable that's limited to only being able to emit n elements. How would you typically use this? We typically use this to limit what would otherwise be infinite streams. So you take a look here. This is the example we'd seen a little bit ago. We talked about the interval method, the factor method for observable. And that method was going to generate an infinite series of integers starting at 0 in a background thread every 2 millisecond time periods, let's say every half second or every 10 seconds or whatever we want to make that. But we may not want this thing to run forever. So what are we going to do? We're going to limit it. We're going to suppress the output after S max iteration values have flown through that particular stream. So that's how we're going to use take to suppress an otherwise infinite series of values. It should obviously come as no surprise that the take operator on a flux works exactly the same. And it should also be no surprise that there's something similar in Java Streams. In Java Streams, this operator is called limit, and it limits you to the number that you pass in as a parameter. So this particular example is going to generate values from 1 to infinity. It's only going to allow odd numbers through, but it's going to limit to the first 100 odd numbers. And then we collect those into a list. The third and final suppressing operator we're going to talk about right now is the most curious of the three we've talked about to this point. And this is called the ignoreElements operator. And what it does is it ignores all the items that are emitted by the current observable. What it does, it only calls the onComplete or onError hook methods, but not the onNext method. So it only indicates when something's done, and it only indicates when something has an error, but it doesn't indicate when something has the next value. So it really suppresses things. It returns something called a completable instance, and a completable instance is also a rather curious class that's defined in the RxJava reactive types family of classes. And it emits, the completable class, or an instance of completable, emits no value at all, but only indicates completion or exception/error. And again, at this point, you might be sort of puzzled as to why on earth you would need such a thing. Well, there's some really good reasons to use it. But first, let's show what it does, and then we'll explain why you might want one of these things. So it's basically a data suppressing operator that ignores its payload. So here's a particular example where we're going to generate a stream of values at an interval, like every second or whatnot. We're going to check to see whether or not those values are prime. When the stream is complete, we're going to display everything. And the very last thing we're going to do is we're going to return a completable from ignoreElements. And you might ask the question, why on earth are we doing this? And the reason is there might be something up the chain that wants to know when something is finished so it can keep track of how many asynchronous computations are running and then shut itself down when they're all done. And in particular, that's exactly what we do with our async task barrier framework. Interestingly enough, Project Reactor doesn't really have an equivalent, although it does have this operator called then that can be used in very much the same way. And in fact, the async task barrier for Project Reactor uses then as a trigger to indicate something's done, whereas the async task barrier for the RxJava framework uses ignoreElements or ignoreElement in order to be able to wait for the completion of something to know when all the tasks have finished running. So it's a very curious operator. Comes in quite handy when you're trying to be informed when something has finished. So that's the end of the overview of key suppressing operators in the observable class.